The classroom was suffocatingly silent, the kind of silence that weighed heavy on the chest. 26 pairs of eyes were glued to the center of the room where Maya stood, her hands trembling at her sides. Her books lay scattered on the floor, some of the pages bent under the weight of her professor's disdainful glare. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, a cruel backdrop to the humiliation unfolding. "Maya, I've had enough of your attitude." Professor Whitman's voice cut through the silence like a blade, cold and sharp. He stood towering behind his desk, his face a mask of authority and irritation. "This is my classroom, and you don't belong here if you don't follow the rules." Maya's voice faltered as she tried to explain herself. "Professor, I wasn't being disrespectful. I was just—" "Enough!" he barked, slamming his hand on the desk. The sound made a few students flinch. "You've disrupted this class for the last time. Maybe you should rethink your place here." The weight of those words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Her place here? Maya had worked harder than anyone to earn her spot in this program. She had spent sleepless nights studying, juggling part-time jobs to support herself, and overcoming hurdles most of her classmates couldn't even begin to imagine. She bit her lip, refusing to let the tears forming in her eyes fall. Not here. Not in front of them. Around her, the classroom was a tableau of reactions. Some students looked down at their desks, unwilling to meet her gaze, their silence a betrayal. A few exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions a mix of pity and discomfort. And then there were those who smirked, their privilege shielding them from the weight of the moment. They didn't have to imagine what it felt like to be told you didn't belong. They'd never been made to feel that way. Maya bent down to pick up her books, her movements slow and deliberate, as if each action required her to summon all the strength she had left. Her fingers trembled as she gathered the last notebook. She straightened up, her back stiff, and looked directly at Professor Whitman. For a moment the room held its breath. "I belong here," Maya said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "You can't take that away from me." But Whitman only scoffed, gesturing toward the door. "Get out. Now." The sound of her footsteps echoed as she walked toward the door. She could feel the weight of their stares on her back, but she didn't look back. As the door closed behind her, the classroom erupted into whispers, the muted sound of complicity. Outside, Maya leaned against the cold brick wall, her chest heaving. She wiped her eyes quickly, anger and humiliation coursing through her veins. But she didn't let herself cry. Not yet. There was more to fight for, and she wasn't about to let this moment define her. Maya Daniels had always been brilliant. Her mother used to say she had a fire in her eyes, a hunger that couldn't be tamed. Born and raised in a small apartment in Southside Chicago, Maya had grown up in a world that constantly tried to limit her, but she refused to accept its boundaries. She was the kind of person who believed that hard work and determination could pave the way to a better future, a belief that had been instilled in her by her parents, who worked tirelessly to give her the opportunities they never had. Her father, a mechanic with grease-stained hands and a heart of gold, often told her, "Maya, the world won't hand you anything. You've got to take it." Her mother, a nurse who worked double shifts, would add, "But don't forget to do it with grace. Show them who you are, baby girl." For as long as she could remember, Maya dreamed of attending Harvard University. To her, that ivy-covered campus was more than just a school. It was a symbol of everything she had worked for, a place that could open doors to a future she had always envisioned. But getting there wasn't easy. Her public high school lacked resources, and the teachers were often overwhelmed trying to manage overcrowded classrooms. Despite this, Maya excelled. She took every advanced placement class available, stayed late to tutor other students, and even managed to secure an internship at a local nonprofit that focused on education reform. But for all her accomplishments, Maya was no stranger to the barriers that came with being a young black woman in America. Systemic racism wasn't just a buzzword to her, it was a lived experience. She saw it in the way teachers underestimated her, in the way store clerks followed her around as if she were a thief, and in the way people's attitudes shifted when they heard the zip code she was from. Even at Crestwood Academy, the prestigious private school where she had earned a full scholarship, Maya often felt the sting of being an outsider. The students there came from wealthy families, their lives cushioned by privilege. They drove luxury cars to school, wore designer clothes, and spoke casually about vacations in Paris and summers in the Hamptons. Maya, on the other hand, took the bus every morning, wearing carefully ironed thrift store clothes. She ate lunch alone most days, not because she wanted to, but because the invisible walls of class and race often felt insurmountable. Still, she refused to let any of it deter her. She had her eyes fixed on the prize, a future where she could use her education to uplift her community. Maya wanted to study political science and law, to eventually become an advocate for educational equity. She dreamed of a world where children from neighborhoods like hers wouldn't have to fight so hard just to get a decent education. She wanted to be the change she had always longed for. Her teachers often described her as determined, but there was one person who didn't see her that way: Professor Whitman. He taught one of the most important classes in her curriculum, Advanced Constitutional Studies, a required course for students preparing for law school. Whitman was known for his strict demeanor and no-nonsense approach, but it was clear that his expectations weren't the same for everyone. From the very first day of class, Maya had sensed his disdain. It was in the way he questioned her answers more harshly than others, the way he dismissed her ideas with a wave of his hand, and the way his eyes would narrow when she spoke up. She had tried to brush it off at first, convincing herself that she was imagining things, but the evidence kept piling up. It wasn't just her. Other students had noticed it too, though few dared to say anything. Maya had told herself that she wouldn't let him get to her. She was here to learn, not to win his approval. But deep down, it hurt. She had worked so hard to get to Crestwood, to prove that she belonged in spaces like this, only to be reminded that, to some people, she never would. And yet, Maya persisted. She spent hours in the library, poring over legal texts and drafting essays that challenged conventional thinking. She joined the debate team, where her eloquence and quick wit earned her recognition. Despite Whitman's cold treatment, Maya's grades in his class remained stellar, a testament to her determination to succeed on her own merit. But no amount of preparation could have readied her for what happened that day in class. The humiliation, the injustice, it shook her to her core. As she stood outside the classroom trying to steady her breathing, Maya couldn't help but wonder, how much more would she have to endure just to prove that she deserved to be here? The day had started like any other. Maya had arrived early, as she always did, her backpack slung over one shoulder and a cup of lukewarm coffee in her hand. The halls of Crestwood Academy were quiet in the mornings, the polished floors gleaming under the soft glow of the overhead lights. Maya liked this time of day because it gave her a chance to breathe, to remind herself why she was here and what she was working toward. But today, there was a tension in the air that Maya couldn't quite place. She brushed it off as nerves. Professor Whitman had assigned a major project, and today was the day they were presenting their initial findings. Maya's project focused on the 14th Amendment and its implications for modern civil rights cases. She had spent weeks researching, her notes meticulously organized into color-coded sections. This presentation wasn't just an assignment for her. It was a chance to prove to herself that she could excel, even under the harshest scrutiny. As the class filed in, Maya took her seat near the front, her laptop open and ready. The room buzzed with low chatter as students exchanged notes and last-minute ideas. Professor Whitman entered a moment later, his presence commanding instant silence. He set his briefcase on the desk with a sharp thud and began calling on students one by one to present. Maya's turn came about halfway through. She stood, her heart pounding, but her expression calm. She walked to the front of the room, her notes in hand, and began her presentation. Her voice was steady as she outlined her thesis, weaving together historical context and contemporary relevance. She cited landmark Supreme Court cases, highlighted key data points, and even posed thought-provoking questions to the class. By the time she was done, she felt a flicker of pride. She had nailed it. But then came Whitman's response. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest. "That was ambitious." His tone was laced with condescension, and the word hung in the air like a challenge. Maya stiffened. "Ambitious, sir?" she asked, keeping her voice respectful but firm. "Yes, ambitious," he repeated, his gaze narrowing. "You've certainly put in a lot of effort, but I can't help but feel that your argument lacks depth. You seem to be relying on emotion rather than critical analysis." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Maya felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she refused to back down. "With all due respect, Professor, I believe my argument is both well-researched and logically sound. I've provided evidence to support each of my claims." Whitman's expression darkened. "And now you're challenging me?" he said, his voice dangerously low. "This is exactly what I mean. You need to learn your place, Ms. Daniels." The words hit her like a slap. Learn your place. The room went deathly silent, every pair of eyes darting between Maya and Whitman. Maya opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Whitman stood abruptly. "That's enough," he said. "I won't tolerate this kind of behavior in my classroom. Pack your things and leave." For a moment, Maya couldn't move. She stared at him, her mind racing. Was this really happening? She had done nothing wrong. She had followed every rule, met every expectation, and still, she was being punished. Slowly, she gathered her belongings, her hands trembling as she stuffed her laptop into her bag. Around her, the class remained frozen. A few students looked at her with wide eyes, their expressions a mix of shock and guilt. Others avoided her gaze altogether, their silence a damning confirmation of how deeply ingrained this dynamic was. No one spoke up. No one defended her. As she walked toward the door, she heard someone whisper, "This is so unfair." Another voice hushed them quickly. Maya didn't look back. She couldn't. If she did, the tears she was holding back might spill over, and she refused to give Whitman the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The hallway felt colder than usual, the fluorescent lights harsh against her vision. Maya leaned against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to steady her breathing. Her mind replayed the scene over and over, each iteration sharpening the sting of Whitman's words. "Learn your place." The phrase echoed in her head, a cruel reminder of the barriers she had spent her entire life trying to overcome. But even as anger and humiliation coursed through her, Maya felt something else. Resolve. She had come too far, worked too hard to let this moment define her. She wouldn't let Whitman or anyone else take away what she had fought so hard to achieve. Inside the classroom, the tension lingered long after Maya's departure. A few students whispered among themselves, their voices low and cautious. One student, a boy named Ethan who sat near the back, raised his hand hesitantly. "Professor Whitman," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "don't you think that was a bit harsh?" Whitman turned to him, his expression unreadable. "This is my classroom," he said curtly, "and I expect my students to respect my authority. If Ms. Daniels can't handle that, then perhaps she doesn't belong here." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. No one dared to challenge him further. The events of the day should have ended there, with Maya walking away from the classroom, her dignity bruised but her resolve intact. But fate had other plans, and the wheels of justice were already in motion, quietly, steadily building toward a reckoning that no one, least of all Professor Whitman, could have anticipated. It began that afternoon, in the quiet of the administration office. Maya had gone straight to the principal's office after leaving the classroom, her emotions still raw but her mind clear. Principal Cartwright, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and an air of perpetual exhaustion, listened as Maya recounted what had happened. He nodded occasionally, his brow furrowing as he jotted down notes. When she finished, he looked at her with a pained expression. "Maya, I assure you, we take these matters very seriously," he said, his tone carefully measured. "I'll investigate this incident thoroughly." Maya nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. She had seen how these things usually played out, how institutions like Crestwood often prioritized their reputation over justice. Still, she had done what she could. The rest, as her mother always said, was in God's hands. What Maya didn't know was that her story was already gaining traction. That evening, as she sat in her modest apartment trying to focus on her homework, a series of events began unfolding that would change everything. It started with Ethan, the boy who had spoken up in class. Troubled by what he had witnessed, he had confided in his older sister, a journalist for a prominent local news outlet. She, in turn, had reached out to Maya, asking for her permission to share the story. Maya hesitated at first, wary of drawing more attention to herself, but after some thought she agreed. If her experience could shine a light on the broader issues of systemic racism and inequality, then perhaps it was worth it. The article was published the next morning, titled, "Expelled for Speaking Up, A Student's Fight for Dignity at Crestwood Academy." It painted a vivid picture of what had happened in Whitman's classroom. It didn't take long for the story to go viral. Social media exploded with outrage, the hashtags Honor Justice for Maya and Crestwood Racism trending within hours. People from all over the country weighed in, their comments ranging from disbelief to fury. Whitman, who prided himself on his strict control over his classroom, was completely blindsided. He first learned of the article when his phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, emails, messages, and calls from colleagues, students, and even parents. His name was suddenly everywhere, tied to accusations of racism and abuse of power. And then came the revelation that shattered his carefully constructed authority. It happened during an emergency meeting called by Principal Cartwright. Whitman had arrived late, his usual confidence replaced by a thinly veiled panic. The principal's office was packed with other faculty members, all of them murmuring anxiously as they waited for the meeting to begin. Whitman took a seat near the back, his face flushed. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Cartwright began, standing at the front of the room. "I'm sure you're all aware of the situation involving Professor Whitman and one of our students, Maya Daniels. This incident has drawn significant attention and we need to address it immediately." Whitman cleared his throat, raising a hand. "Principal Cartwright, if I may." "You'll have a chance to speak in a moment, Professor," Cartwright interrupted, his tone uncharacteristically stern. "But first, there's something you all need to know about Ms. Daniels." He paused, letting the room settle into silence before continuing. "Maya Daniels is the daughter of Charles Daniels." The name landed like a thunderclap. Whitman's jaw dropped, his face draining of color. Around the room, faculty members exchanged stunned glances. Charles Daniels was a household name, a self-made African-American millionaire who had reshaped the real estate industry. Known for his philanthropy and advocacy for educational reform, he was a figure of immense influence and respect. His foundation had donated millions to underprivileged schools, and he was widely regarded as a champion of equality. Whitman's mind raced. He had known Maya came from modest means. Her scholarship status was no secret, but he had never imagined she was connected to someone like Charles Daniels. The realization hit him like a freight train. He hadn't just humiliated a student, he had humiliated the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the country. Cartwright continued, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Mr. Daniels has been made aware of the situation, and he is understandably concerned. He has requested a meeting with the school board to discuss this matter further." Whitman opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, their expressions a mix of disbelief and thinly veiled judgment. For the first time in his career, he felt powerless. Meanwhile, Maya was unaware of the storm brewing around her. She had tried to keep her head down, focusing on her classes and avoiding the whispers that followed her in the hallways. But when her phone buzzed with a text from her father that afternoon, she knew something was happening. "Proud of you, kiddo," the message read. "We'll talk tonight." Maya stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Her father rarely texted her during the day. He was always so busy with meetings and projects. Whatever he wanted to talk about, it was big. That evening, as she sat across from him in their living room, Charles Daniels listened intently as Maya recounted everything that had happened. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I'm sorry this happened to you, Maya," he said finally, "but I'm proud of the way you handled it. You didn't let him break you." Maya nodded, her throat tight. "I didn't want to tell you because I wanted to succeed on my own, without people knowing who you are." Her father smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "I understand, sweetheart, and you've already proven yourself, but now it's time for me to step in." The meeting with the school board was nothing short of a spectacle. Word of Maya's story, and her father's involvement, had spread like wildfire, drawing the attention of local news stations and even national media outlets. By the time Charles Daniels arrived at Crestwood Academy with his legal team in tow, the parking lot was swarming with reporters, their cameras flashing like fireworks as he stepped out of his sleek black car. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. Whitman sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, his usually impeccable suit slightly rumpled. His face was pale, his confidence shattered. Across from him sat Charles Daniels, his presence commanding and calm, with Maya by his side. She looked poised and composed, though the tight grip she had on her father's hand betrayed her nerves. Principal Cartwright opened the meeting, his voice tinged with unease. "Thank you all for coming today. We're here to address the incident involving Professor Whitman and Ms. Maya Daniels, which has garnered significant attention. Mr. Daniels, the floor is yours." Charles Daniels stood, his tall frame towering over the room. He didn't raise his voice, but the power in his words was undeniable. Let me begin by saying that I am not here to destroy anyone's career. I believe in second chances. But I am also here to ensure that my daughter, and every other student at this institution, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. He turned to face Whitman, his gaze steady. Professor Whitman, you didn't just humiliate my daughter. You sent a message to every student in that classroom that no matter how hard they work, no matter how much they achieve, they will always be seen as less in your eyes. That is unacceptable. Whitman opened his mouth to respond, but Daniels raised a hand, silencing him. You owe my daughter an apology, but more importantly, you owe her and every other student you've wronged a commitment to change. This isn't just about one incident. It's about the culture you've perpetuated. The room was silent, the weight of Daniels' words sinking in. Whitman's hands trembled as he adjusted his tie, his voice barely audible when he finally spoke. I deeply regret what happened. Ms. Daniels, I acted poorly, and I'm sorry for the pain I caused you. Maya met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She didn't respond, but the strength in her silence spoke volumes. The school board deliberated for hours after the meeting, weighing the public outcry against Whitman's years of service. In the end, they made their decision. Whitman was to be terminated effective immediately. Additionally, the school announced plans to implement new diversity and inclusion training for all faculty and staff, as well as the formation of a student-led committee to address issues of systemic bias within the institution. The news spread quickly, and the public response was overwhelming. Social media erupted with praise for Maya and her father, hailing them as champions of justice. Maya's classmates, many of whom had stayed silent during the incident, began reaching out to her with messages of support and apology. Some admitted they had been too afraid to speak up, while others expressed regret for not recognizing the biases they had been complicit in. For Maya, the journey didn't end there. Her story had become a symbol of resilience and the fight against systemic injustice, and she was determined to use her platform to make a difference. With her father's guidance, she began speaking at schools and community events, sharing her experiences and advocating for educational equity. She started a blog, where she wrote about the challenges and triumphs of being a young Black woman, navigating spaces that weren't designed for her success. Her voice resonated far and wide, inspiring countless others to stand up for themselves and demand change. Letters poured in from students across the country, many of them sharing their own stories of discrimination and thanking Maya for giving them hope. She read every single one, her heart swelling with a mix of sadness and determination. There was so much work to be done, but she was ready for it. As for Whitman, his career was over, at least in academia. The public backlash was swift and unforgiving, and he became a cautionary tale of what happens when prejudice goes unchecked. While he issued a formal apology and attempted to rebuild his reputation, the damage was done. He faded into obscurity, a relic of a past that society was determined to leave behind. For Crestwood Academy, the incident served as a wake-up call. The school's administration took steps to rebuild trust with its students and their families, implementing policies aimed at creating a more inclusive and equitable environment. It was a small step, but an important one, and for Maya, life moved forward. She graduated at the top of her class, earning a full scholarship to Harvard University. On the day she received her acceptance letter, she sat in her childhood bedroom, tears streaming down her face as she held the letter tightly in her hands. She had made it, not because of her father's name, but because of her own hard work, resilience, and unwavering belief in herself. As she walked across the stage at her high school graduation, the audience erupted into applause. Among the sea of faces, she spotted her parents, their pride shining brighter than the sun. Maya smiled, her heart full. This was just the beginning. Maya's story became a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of speaking truth to power, and the necessity of fighting for justice. It reminded the world that systemic racism and prejudice are not relics of the past, but challenges we must confront every day. As Maya stood on the steps of Harvard's campus years later, now a first-year law student, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, the humiliation she had endured, the battles she had fought. They had all shaped her into the woman she was becoming, and as she looked out over the bustling campus, she felt a deep sense of purpose. This fight isn't over, she whispered to herself, but I'm ready. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, everyone who had ever been silenced or underestimated. And in her heart, Maya knew, the best way to honor her journey was to keep moving forward, one step closer to a world where justice and equality weren't just ideals but realities.